Time is a relentless enemy, the only one that even John Wayne couldn't outrun or outmaneuver. By the mid-1970s, the sun was beginning to set on the golden age of Hollywood, an era Wayne had carried on his broad shoulders for nearly half a century. For the man who had personified the American spirit in its most rugged and uncompromising form, the long shadows were stretching across his own life. But the Duke didn't believe in surrendering to the inevitable. He didn't believe in fading away quietly into the night or accepting the limitations of a failing body. His final years weren't a slow, tragic decline. They were a fierce, defiant, and deeply personal crusade. He was determined to prove that the values he stood for, honor, grit, and an unyielding spirit, were as immortal as the legends he had created on the silver screen. To understand the weight of this final chapter, we must look at the landscape of 1976. Hollywood was changing. The classic Western was being replaced by gritty, cynical urban dramas. The world seemed to be moving on from the moral clarity of the Duke's era. Yet, it was in this moment that John Wayne signed on for a project that would become the most hauntingly poetic chapter of his entire career, The Shootist. In the film, he played J.B. Brooks, an aging gunfighter dying of a terminal illness, looking for a way to exit the world with his dignity intact. It was a role that felt less like a script and more like a premonition. As the cameras rolled, the line between John Wayne and J.B. Brooks began to disappear, creating a performance so raw, so honest, and so vulnerable that it transcended the medium of acting altogether. The production of The Shootist was nothing short of a miracle of human will. Wayne was nearly 70 years old, and his body was a battlefield. Decades of grueling stunts, heavy smoking, and a previous brutal encounter with cancer had left him with only one lung and several missing ribs. Every breath was a struggle. Every step across the dusty sets of Carson City was an act of defiance. His co-stars, including a young Ron Howard and his longtime friend Lauren Bacall, watched in hushed awe as the Duke pushed through waves of exhaustion and pain. He refused to let his illness dictate the filming schedule. He would arrive early, his face etched with the weariness of a man who knew his time was short, yet he would transform the moment the director called action. He wanted to leave the audience with a final image of strength, not of a man defeated by time, but of a man living his final moments on his own absolute terms. Off camera, the reality was a closely guarded secret of immense suffering. Wayne was secretly battling a new and aggressive wave of health complications. The Big C, as he stoically called it, had returned with a vengeance, this time targeting his stomach and colon. But even as his doctors delivered increasingly grim prognosis, Wayne's focus remained outward. He became a silent symbol of hope for millions of people fighting their own battles with illness. He didn't complain, he didn't seek pity. Instead, he made public appearances, gave powerful interviews, and continued to champion the causes he believed in, from veterans' rights to the preservation of the American wilderness. His last crusade was about ensuring that the flame of the American myth would continue to burn long after his own light had flickered out. Behind the scenes, the Duke was also settling his affairs with the same meticulous care he gave to a film production. He spent hours talking to his children, passing down the wisdom of a life lived at the center of the world stage. He spoke of the importance of integrity, the necessity of hard work, and the duty to stand up for what is right, even when it's unpopular. These weren't just the words of a father. They were the final instructions of a legend ensuring his legacy was in safe hands. He looked at his production company, Bad Jack, not just as a business, but as a vessel for the stories that still needed to be told, stories of courage and the human spirit. Perhaps the most emotional moment of this final chapter occurred at the 1979 Academy Awards. It would be his final public appearance, and everyone in the room seemed to know it. When John Wayne walked onto the stage to present the award for Best Picture, he was visibly thinner, his clothes hanging loosely on a frame that had once seemed indestructible. But as he stood before the microphone, the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted. The entire room, the biggest stars, the toughest directors, the cynical critics, rose in a thunderous, prolonged standing ovation that seemed to last an eternity. It was a collective outpouring of love and respect for a man who had become a fundamental part of the American soul. With a shaky but determined voice, he looked out at the crowd and said, "I'm a survivor. and I'll be around for a long time to come." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated grace that left the world in tears. In his final months, Wayne sought refuge on his beloved yacht, the Wild Goose. This converted minesweeper was his sanctuary, surrounded by the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, far from the flashbulbs and the relentless demands of Hollywood. He found a profound sense of peace. He would sit on the deck for hours, watching the waves and reflecting on a journey that had taken him from the dusty backlots of Republic Pictures to the heights of international superstardom. He had survived scandals, political wars, and personal tragedies that would have broken a lesser man. He had been the face of a nation's ideals through its darkest and brightest hours. As the end drew near, he felt not bitterness, but a deep sense of gratitude for the life he had been allowed to lead. The end finally came in June 1979 at the UCLA Medical Center. Even in his final days, the Duke's room was filled with the spirit of the Old West. He was surrounded by his family, his most loyal friends, and the quiet dignity that had defined him. When the news of his passing broke, the world stopped. Flags were flown at half-mast, and from the White House to the smallest ranches in the Midwest, a sense of profound loss was felt. It was as if a mountain had vanished from the horizon. He was buried in a quiet cemetery in Newport Beach, in an unmarked grave for many years to prevent it from becoming a spectacle, a final act of humility from a man who had been larger than life. His tombstone eventually bore a simple, powerful epitaph that he had once suggested during a casual conversation years earlier. Feo, fuerte y formal. Translated from Spanish, it means he was ugly, strong, and had dignity. It was the perfect, unvarnished summary of a man who never pretended to be a polished idol. He was a man of the earth, a man of action, and a man of his word. He knew he wasn't perfect, but he lived with a consistency and a courage that few could ever hope to match. This was the essence of the Iron Will, the refusal to be anything other than exactly who he was until the very end. The legacy of John Wayne's final stand is not one of tragedy, but of monumental inspiration. He showed us that the true measure of a man is not how he begins his journey, but how he finishes it. He proved that even when the body fails and the world changes, the spirit can remain unbroken and sovereign. He remains the ultimate archetype of the American hero because he was authentic. He was flawed, he was tough, he was occasionally stubborn, but he was undeniably human. As we look back on his extraordinary life through the lens of history, we see a man who didn't just play a hero on the screen. He embodied the hero's journey until his very last breath. The Duke may have finally ridden off into that final sunset, but his shadow still looms large over the landscape of our culture, reminding us that while men are mortal, the legends they leave behind are truly forever.